So Dan, you are in charge.
I'm in charge.
You remain in charge.
Oh, I'm in charge. And so what's our topic now? Remind me.
Consciousness. We're moving on to consciousness. But your job is to tell David to say something.
So, well, I think that would be good because, quite frankly, I want to hear new things about consciousness, and I'm pretty sure that David will say things that I haven't heard before, and I'm not sure who else would. So, David, tell us what you want to tell us.
Well, I thought I'd just give you two brief examples from the interface of psychology and neuroscience that are maybe germane to the discussion we had in the last hour about free will or volition or whatever we're now calling it. I don't know what the consensus here is. And conscious experience. And one is just to point out something from brain science and psychology about the Libet studies, which get a lot of airtime. And there's this relationship between when something happens in your head and your ostensibly conscious perception of that. Those experiments, well, when we think about them or talk about them informally, or I guess makes the presupposition that there's an arrow of time. And there is an arrow of time. Okay, and if the arrow, so it makes a presupposition from the perspective of psychology that the arrow of time is something Newtonian, like absolute, true mathematical time of itself and by its own nature flows equably without relation to anything external. And we also assume as a presupposition that behavior cannot be unpaused. And so we make we assume that the local temporal order of events matters. I think we can probably agree on that. But it turns out that depends on what local is. Right? So local it doesn't follow from something like the Newtonian arrow of time. So from a brain science and a psychology point of view, time just isn't like that. So it's more like a string of beads or a series of little temporal islands. And those little islands have a certain size. And so for instance, one size for which we have really a huge amount of evidence in experimental research is on the order of a quarter of a second or something like that. So there is an arrow overall, but that arrow is actually a series of little chunks, and the chunk size is pretty coarse. It's coarse-grained, and it turns out that within that chunk you don't actually have to respect the order. Things get even worse. An example I was just telling. So there's a big let's say a big a chain of pearls where the pearls are really fat and big, and let's say a quarter of a second big. There's another chain that you're wearing where the pearls are really rather small, let's say on the order of 50 milliseconds or something like that. Those are two strikingly different sizes of temporal experience, and it's within that local temporal order doesn't even have to be respected at all. So you can actually change the order of things and pay no price perceptually, which is kind of bizarre.
You still have the same conscious.
You have the same conscious experience.
Duration.
Absolutely. So let me give you I just spoke a very concrete example. Suppose we're listening to each other here. I take the sentence, I record it, and I chop it up. I just take the file. You can do it actually right now on your laptops. I chop up the file, and I take each slice and I flip it backwards. Right, so if I take the whole sentence and I flip it backwards, it's like, and you couldn't understand anything. So as you make the slices smaller and smaller, there is a slice size at which you pay no perceptual price, and your judgments are the same. And that turns out to be roughly 60 milliseconds or something like that. That's pretty interesting. Right? So now at the coarse grain scale, the arrow of time is going in the predicted direction that we need, otherwise we're really screwed. But at the local scale, it's actually something quite different is happening from the perspective of the perceptual apparatus and the neurophysiological foundations of how you do that. So there are these. So that sort of undermines the most straightforward interpretations of the Libet experiment too, because you actually chunk things into much coarser grain before as you attribute to conscious experience.
It doesn't undermine the claim that we should be very doubtful about the confident assertions that we make on the basis of conscious introspection. In fact, it reinforces it.
That's fine. No objection.
But it's very compatible with the idea that what we call consciousness is a higher level emergent phenomenon, and sort of different ways of rearranging the microscopic pieces.
I think so. I think it's because it's very bizarre otherwise.
It's also compatible with the claim that all of Shakespeare's plays were written by Ben Jonson. I don't know, where did this emergentism come from, this description? How did you know?
Well, because, I mean, in
Are
the...
you consciously confident of what you're saying?
No, I'm not consciously
Okay.
confident.
Let's check.
All right, then
I'm sorry, so
keep
go on.
going, yeah.
I think we should return to that though, because I agree with Sean's point there. Just a second example, because, and I guess I was moved by Stephen's point of that there surely is a causal chain of things, and some of them are conscious as you decided to come here and visit your granddaughter or whatever it was, and so you're
And you?
and even me. So we also know that very little actually enters into our conscious experience but that makes a difference in the stuff we decide, right? So here's an experimental example that's straightforward and kind of cool. Take the cocktail party stuff. So I'm listening to here almost concurrently, let's say Dan and Steve or something like that time, and I'm able to select one or the other conversation. So I can pick that out using something called attention. Who knows how that works for that?
What's it called?
Selective attention. Somehow I can attend to one of the streams at a party, right? So there's a big mess. You guys are.
He wasn't attending.
He wasn't attending. Right. So I can select. So there's concurrent information. Right? I can select one stream over another. Now I happen to know that both are encoded. I mean, I can show you that experimentally. So both actually are encoded in perceptual systems. But what I can also show you is that the information in the unattended stream, which you cannot report to me, you don't know anything that was said there, actually influences in a systematic, predictable, principled way decisions that you make later, for instance, about what words you recognize or something like that. Right? So I can.
Are you willing to describe that other stream as a stream of information that you have no consciousness of?
Yes, I am. Right. So it's just now. Does that information play a causal role in how you made subsequent decisions? I'd say yes, because I rigged it that way. I can do the experiment, so I put all the words in the way that subsequently they influence you. So I guess I'm nervous or squeamish about the importance of the conscious access to the decision making that you seem to require at the end of your discussion, because so much of it is. I mean, you're moving concepts around in your head, but is that movement of the concepts and arranging them until you come to the decision uncaused? Presumably not. I mean, I'm more incompatibilist in that sense.
Debner and Jacobi and others have done experiments which get at this issue, I think, rather nicely. This is another unattended channel type experiment. This is word stem completion.
Mm.
So you're given like FRA blank, and your job is to fill out FRA with Frankfurter, fragile, frap, whatever you come up with. So it's always come up with a word. And the thing is that there's a prime that's presented in advance, and there's also a mask. So it's mask priming. And if the mask is temporally close enough to the prime, then you get this effect, which is like your unattended channel in speech, that there are effects of the priming word that the subject's completely unconscious about, not surprisingly. Now, all you have to do is simply increase the latency before the onset of the prime, so that now the priming word enters conscious. We don't even have to say the word, but we just change the latency, and we get a stunning effect. The word is still having an effect, but the particular effect that they were looking for is don't say the word that the prime is. I mean, your subjects are told you're going to be primed with a word, might be say fragile. You're not told what the words are at all. You just say, in every case, before you do the word stem completion, there will be a prime word. The clue is, don't say that word, say some other word instead. If the priming word is masked, so you're not conscious of it, you will say that word almost every time. I don't know, much of the time. It raises the frequency with which you say the word you're not supposed to say. All you have to do is change the latency of the mask so that you're conscious of it, then you won't, obviously. And the point of this is consciousness is a way, if you're conscious of something, you can hinge policy on it in a way that you can't if it's unconscious. In both cases, there are effects, but if you're conscious of it, you can set up in advance a policy which says, well, I must remember not to do X, or I must remember to do X when I see Y. Only if you consciously see Y can you set up such a policy. So there is a very clear case where becoming conscious of a stimulus makes a huge difference in what you can do with it.
Where's the reference for that?
That's Debner and Jacobi.
Thank you.
There's a lot of experiments that have that effect, but that's one.
I think I know what Alex was getting at with the Ben Jonson comment, and maybe I now have the response. So when I said in response to David that it's compatible with this emergent idea, what I guess was implicitly saying is it's obvious that that doesn't seem compatible with the idea that consciousness is fundamental. But it also doesn't seem incompatible with the idea that it's emergent. So I think that it's not evidence for consciousness being emergent, just like it's not evidence for Ben Jonson or Shakespeare's authorship. But it does help weigh if those two options are what you're considering, I think that it pushes the balance down a little bit. If there's the third option you're considering, that we shouldn't just be talking about consciousness at all, then sure, everything David is saying.
We certainly can't do that, and the experiment that Dan just gave us is profound evidence that we cannot ignore consciousness at all. It definitely sometimes has a causal role.
Good, sure. No, I'd be happy with that. Yes.
You know, the question that I'm interested in is, what is consciousness consist in? Okay? What is its function? These are not questions that we have much of a handle on at all. What we do know already from a lot of the experimentation, including what you've just described, is that consciousness systematically misleads us as an epistemic source.
You mean talk of consciousness?
No,
or
our own consciousness misleads
Okay.
us about many facts of the matter, including vision.
It's very
will,
depressing. Memory?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that is.
If we have to choose between the first person point of view and the third person point of view, then I'm strongly of the opinion that we naturalists should choose the third person point of view when they're in conflict.
Yes, but there is no such thing as a third person point of view other than as the result of a bunch of first person points of view. I mean, let's not forget that the way we interpersonally verify things is because we all go through a process of conscious analysis of, whatever, I'm reading the paper, I'm thinking about the paper, I'm responding to the paper, and so on and so forth. So, yes, one needs to be very careful. It's similar to you can make the same exact argument for color perception. We know that, or perception in general, we know that we can be mistaken perception, therefore we should go all around blind because we can't trust it. No, we don't have that option. We just don't, and I don't think we have it in the case of consciousness either. It's a good thing to be careful and aware, consciously aware, of the fact that there are limits and systematic biases and all that sort of stuff. But you just can't go around doing anything, including having these discussions, without it. So I'm not understanding why all these ganging up on consciousness thing. Where does that come from?
Sort of, but I mean, look, it's a perennial issue in the behavioral sciences, right? Should we often have conflicts between what subjects report and our interpretations of how subjects behave. So that's, I assume, what Alex is getting at when he talks about conflict between third-person evidence and first-person evidence. And, I mean, I think the history of the behavioral science overwhelmingly tells us Alex is right about that, right?
Yes.
You always want that behavioral
Yes,
check.
but how do we do the behavioral check?
Well, it depends. Lots of different ways depending on,
My point was that the behavioral check cannot do without the person's checking conscious involvement.
Well, that's
in this,
one kind
right?
of behavioral test you can do. You can ask people what they're conscious of, the heterophenomenology of third-person science. I mean, psychophysics depends on, many experiments depend on getting subject reports. And perfectly good science. It's relying on their consciousness, but there's all sorts of controls in place.
Okay.
Is there a link between, so reason in the previous session played a big role. I think one of the accounts we gave of free will is sort of has to pass through your reasoning faculty. Does it also have to pass through your conscious faculty? If you reason unconsciously, is that somehow not first grade reason?
Yes.
Why is that, then?
It's the difference between,
Let me say that the reason I asked the question is not
The reason that-
non-rhetorical. It's because when you say that, you are immediately attaching more confidence to consciousness than I think is warranted on the basis of what we already know about the degree to which it misleads us.
okay.
So now,
Okay. Of course, there is self-deception and rationalization and ideology and other sources of misdirection where we fool ourselves, where our own conscious introspections of what we're reasoning are unreliable. But it's also the case that it's only conscious reasoning in which we get to articulate carefully and to evaluate and to I'm trying to think, is it Hume who talks about sort of turning the reasons over in your mind and really reflecting on them. It is only conscious reasoning where the reasons themselves become objects of attention. When you reason unconsciously, you may be a demon, you may do it very fast, but you have no way of assessing the reasons themselves. They play the role they do covertly, in effect, whereas when you reason with yourself, when you consciously reason with yourself, to put it bluntly, it's like reasoning with another person. You now have a witness. And if you recognize that sometimes the best way, you're trying to solve a problem, sometimes the best way of doing it is to find a sympathetic interlocutor and say, tell me what you think of this reasoning.
So Dan, are you saying that it's...
And then we do that with ourselves.
So that the reason that you should associate the best reasons with conscious reasoning is just because they happen to be more reliable in general, because they have this kind of turning over property. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, they're more reliable precisely because they are actually tested in a certain way that unconscious reasons aren't tested. They are making
Gregorian creatures, to coin a phrase.
They are subjected to a certain sort of quality control that unconscious reasons aren't.
They're presenting themselves as.
But on the other hand, we should be a bit careful here because, I mean, I do think that there's an intimate connection between what is normatively important about, for example, the kind of volition we were talking about before coffee, and consciousness. On the other hand, there's lots of problems, really very sophisticated problems, dependent on highly learned sort of rational processes that clearly aren't well done by consciousness and are rather better handled without it. So, for example, then a regular experience I have, and other people report the same thing. If I'm doing some pure economic modeling, and I'm trying to write some equations that represent a multidimensional, a complex planar object, which one is often doing. I often just hit a wall, right? And I just can't get it, and I know what works, which is sleep on it.
Yeah.
I'll wake up and it'll be sorted out, right?
We all have that.
And that's quite exactly. So clearly that's there's but this is a math modeling problem, right? So a very cognitive thing to do. It's not like we all know that you mustn't use consciousness to catch a baseball, but this is a cognitive. The same is true for some quite highly sophisticated cognitive.
The phrase, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time, is almost sort of emblematic of the doofus, the stupid person. Oh, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Rueful admission of ignorance and of stupidity. I submit, on the contrary, any agent that can say and mean it seemed like a good idea at the time is an agent which has powers way above the creature that can't say that, because he's got episodic memory of his own thinking. He can think back to what it seemed like at the time and can evaluate what it seemed like at the time. Somebody that can confront an issue and debug his own earlier thinking by going through that exercise is a creature that has powers that we all want to have more of.
But can I ask, do you agree, David? Do you agree that our most sophisticated reasoning abilities happen at the conscious level? I mean, there's lots of good reasons to think so.
I agree, but I don't agree, or I have to be convinced that quality control is actually so great. I mean, you think that making this explicit to yourself has somehow guarantees.
No, it doesn't guarantee anything.
It's basically saying
That
it's better.
well, that it's better though.
But
That's,
yes.
Well, so that is quality
Yeah.
control. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's use the word
It's
better.
like
in that
editing,
case.
right?
It's like editing.
Editing.
So one of
But
the
that's
questions
not-
I have is, when we're talking about particularly volition, we used the will last time, there's the implication of work, that you're resisting something that would have gone on otherwise. And a lot of our conscious activity is engaged in that, and particularly in doing things. Obviously, just listening to something passively, we're not doing that. But as soon as we engage in a problem, or even in deciding when to act, whether it's to raise your hand and push a button, there is some kind of notion of work going on. And of course, we see this in the fMRI. We see that as you begin to do this, metabolism raises. It's you're doing more something. So part of what I want to struggle with is this relationship between consciousness and what you might call a kind of neurological work that's being done. That you're resisting something that would go on spontaneously otherwise. And of course, the otherwise stuff that goes on spontaneous is what we typically say is, it's unconscious, or I'm daydreaming, or whatever.
That's the basic paradigm for impulse control experiments in fMRI, right?
Yeah.
You have, and the key is you've got GABA release in orbital frontal areas that prevents, for example, dopaminergic signaling or signaling from amygdala from directly triggering motor preparation and stuff, right? I mean, and GABA, that seems to be GABA's job, right?
Yeah, it's inhibitory wherever it is, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's used there and that, as far as I understand, that's very strongly correlated with people reporting conscious effort, right? Conscious self-control effort. Strong GABA signaling in.
But also in
frontal area.
striatum.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just in.
No, but I mean, striatum is. There's no GABA.
It's mostly GABA. Striatum is mostly GABA.
Which part of striatum? Striatum is mostly dopamine.
No, it's not. I mean, dopamine projects. I don't want to get into this. I'm sorry, guys, but the striatum is mostly inhibitory. The interesting thing is it's doubly inhibitory. That is, it inhibits an inhibited.
Dorsal or
inhibitory
ventral?
system.
Where are you?
No, the whole striatum. Most of the intrinsic neurons are GABAergic. That doesn't mean they stop something from happening. They stop other neurons from stopping something.
Yeah.
So there can be a sort of, so it's a complicated story.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry.
So can I just put this back to David, because I feel like I didn't hear from, David, you say that there's not quality control, or that we overestimate the quality control in consciousness.
There may be quality control, or we're using the word better, I gather. This is better.
Better, sorry, yeah.
I guess I need evidence for that. I mean, why is a decision that or a conscious act of something better than so for instance, all the evaluation or all the accumulation of priors that forms the basis for making a decision was not consciously arrived at. Am I responsible for all those priors? We're all Bayesian now, and that's, in a Bayesian universe, am I actually, in my conscious reflection, am I responsible for the accumulation of all that information that formed the basis for priors?
Well, notice that
Almost impossible.
if you inhibit yourself from acting and reflect, you're you're just putting it through the machinery a few more times. You're giving the opportunity for more evidence to gather. You're just not proceeding. I mean, there's a sense in which it's trivial that taking longer time and taking more effort and having more systems sort of sign off on something, it may not help it, but it may be just the thing you need. I mean, I don't know if the rest of you share this experience, but many times
there's a growing literature that's not the right generalization, right? This is the Kahneman.
Oh,
kind of
yeah,
thing.
but
So, I mean,
no,
we
I don't
wanna
think it
just
does
fall
show
over
that.
and accept that.
I don't think.
Wait, what about the Kahneman? What does
I don't
that
think
show?
Kahneman's. I think Kahneman's book is wonderful, but I don't think it shows this at all.
I'm not talking about Kahneman, but the entire research program of are there such, fast decision-making systems that actually do remarkably normative, interesting stuff? And
do
sometimes better than
Sometimes better.
conscious. I think that's actually pretty interesting. So, I mean, well, I'll let you have it.
No, go ahead.
I mean, you can deliberate things. Right? You can come to this, I think he calls it type 2, cleverly named. Type 2. So you think about stuff. Or you have type 1 systems that are basically, let's say, reflexive for lack of a better word. Both can act on the same information structure that's an input, and you might get different answers. And so he makes that distinction, and then he has, dozens and dozens of experiments, when they act, to which kind of answer you come. So sometimes this kind of type 1 reasoning, if you will, comes to actually a terrific answer that's in some weird normative sense better than an explicit type 2 kind of answer. I think that's actually...
If you were deciding whether to have brain surgery...
Yes, I think that's fair. I mean, let's, for the sake of argument, let's call it...
Thinking slow.
Thinking slow.
If you were deciding whether to have brain surgery, would you want the brain surgeon to say, yeah? Or would you like the brain surgeon to say, let me discuss it with my colleagues?
If you want someone to hit a baseball, you want to go like, yeah. You don't
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
That's the
so too.
difference. For brain surgery, you want type 2.
But yeah, I think you're missing. There is this thing that these things that we think of as best shunted to the slow stuff are maybe not best shunted to the slow
Yeah,
stuff.
Well,
it's
that was my point.
We just don't know. That's an empirical
That's a
question, I
crazy
think.
fact,
I mean,
right?
Well, except the question is, how many crazy facts? I mean, is this a lot of evidence? I don't think it is. I mean,
Do any of these
sorry, one
we're
thing-
talking about support that? Does it upset our decisions that we think of?
I don't know enough about that literature, to be honest, but
Well,
it's clearly an empirical question whether, for
Yeah,
instance,
no.
the slow system
Exactly.
does
Yeah, yeah.
a better or worse job in a given situation that you set up, in a
So
given,
one
for a
example-
given experimental setup.
One
It's not
example,
obvious.
one thing where a little bit is known, mainly from monkey work, but, then can be sort of quasi-verified in people. So, if you're doing a task that requires randomization, you should use the fast unconscious stuff, because it can actually do it directly, right? And you will not, and you'll be much worse you'll get much further from randomization. And there are some complex things we have to do, right? Some strategic things, for example, where we really do want to randomize. So, I mean, that would be an example.
Is there sort of good evidence or obvious evidence or a lot of evidence that there's a brain level distinction between what we call conscious thought and what we call unconscious thought?
There better be, but we don't know what it is.
What do you mean by brain level? And maybe we better get that one out first.
Well,
I mean,
we're
it's an
talking
anatomical
difference-
question, is that what you're after?
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying,
anatomical
this is the
physiological
naive
question.
undergraduate question, right? So we're
Uh-huh.
talking about two different types of cognition, okay? Conscious and unconscious, just to put the labels on it. So I'm just asking, how clear is it whether a certain act of cognition is conscious or unconscious? For example, can we point to something happening in the brain and we go, oh yes, look, there's a little conscious thought traveling through.
not quite like that, but there are plenty of signs.
better.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah,
just
so
asked
it's
that-
conceivable that we could do
It's a
that.
research
I just asked that to Robert Schulman, a neuroscientist at Yale, and he said, first of all, you have to have a clear behavioral distinction. He said it's very, very easy, the kind of thing an anesthesiologist will test for, are you conscious or not? It's really important to be able to tell. And that what it depends on is overall neuronal activity. There's a certain threshold of overall neuronal activity. There's no part of the brain that's associated with it. It's a global phenomenon.
Well, that makes perfect sense to me, but that doesn't exclude the idea that it would be distinguishable at the brain level, even if it's not localized in a part of the brain, right?
Yeah, it could be, but he said there's no evidence yet
Sure,
of
okay.
that sort of thing.
All right.
And there do seem to be some parts of the brain which is like systematically inaccessible to
Right,
consciousness.
right.
Right?
So basically, midbrain, brainstem.
Brain.
Yeah. So I mean, it's clearly, serious cerebral cortical damage, thalamic damage, can really, knock it out. It's gone. So we know that it's not everywhere in an equal sense.
Sure.
And there are some strange and enticing findings, I don't know how they're standing up, which show that on some tasks which are clearly cognitive and they have nothing to do with motor behavior, you get this action in the cerebellum for novelty. And what that means is what, as far as I know, wide open for speculative theorizing. It's an interesting fact that the part of your brain which tradition or good scientific tradition says is primarily involved in motor control, balance, graceful behavior, and so forth.
Complex coordination,
Yeah, that part of the brain should also be used for coping with novel problems and difficult cognitive problems. That's a really interesting fact.
A very concrete example to give you something to work with.
Yes.
I mean, in the case of the visual system, which is pretty well understood, right? So you have no access to the information that's actually the varieties of information that are represented and computed with in the primary visual cortex. That's granularity which you can't do anything with in conscious access. So. But beyond that, things get pretty interesting, right? So you can see faces, you can see objects, you can see all kinds of stuff, you can see edges. So there's an anatomic sense in which some information in some areas is not available to you, in others it is. So there's a simple one. Right?
I mean, maybe this is intentional or not, or just inevitable, but available to you.
It's conscious.
Right. It's just a synonym for conscious.
The processing that produces, say, visual experience on the basis of a 2D array on the retina involves factors that are hardwired into us way back in evolutionary phylogeny. Okay, not
long before we would have considered things conscious, right? Sure.
Long before there were human beings.
No, I mean, so back when there were no beings around, we now would have considered conscious.
Well, it depends, Fish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Depends how deep.
Yeah. All right. Fair. That's fine.
Yeah, I happen to think fish are conscious. They just don't make the kind of decisions you and I make.
So, what is your definition of consciousness that includes fish?
Well, so basically, it has to be the ability. There's a couple of things. The organization of the brain, even though it doesn't look like yours or mine, basically is laid out the same way. Visual system doesn't have there's not a cortex in the same sense, but and the fish makes a whole set of behavioral decisions. They're quicker, they're slower, they're more automatic, but you can train fish to do interesting things. They obviously can learn. In fact, we now know that their learning by operant capabilities is as good as yours and mine. And so, in all of those senses,
can we reason with them?
No, absolutely not.
There's also a paper on the dimensions of personality in fish.
Oh,
right?
really?
So there's a paper with neurotic guppies and conscientious guppies.
All right.
The Myers-Briggs.
Yeah.
Actually, that would be the big five he's talking about.
Big five. Okay.
How many of you have the experience of thinking you understand something until you actually say it out loud and have it come in your ears? Reading a paper out loud clearly can have a really enhancing effect. And I don't think there's any mystery about why that should be so. You're simply getting other agencies in your brain to have a look at this material and giving them a chance to do whatever they do. So you're feeding pattern into pattern recognizers, and the way I put it with my students, I say, paying yourself for making yourself lunch is clearly futile. Trying to bluff yourself in a solitaire poker is clearly futile. Why should talking to yourself You already know what you're going to say, don't you? Why should that be not futile? And the answer, I think, has to be yourself is actually somewhat divided. And you're getting one part of you to have a conversation with another part of you, hoping that the other part maybe will be able to give you some help, give the first part some help. And it does seem to work.
And so just to tie the whole day together, free will is, I agree, I think someone said this, it's not just, there are definitional semantic issues that we can talk about, whether it's one term or another, but there is then, at the end of the day, some practical implication of responsibility, legal responsibility. And presumably consciousness has some moral responsibilities or implications attached to it. Not only we are conscious and therefore we should be blamed for doing bad things, but it's implicit in what Terry says, where does the animal rights question come down here? What is the program, since I don't know the answer, what should our research program be to decide what rights we give to what beings on the basis of how they think?
Well, you've got to make the distinction between agents and patients in this case. So I wouldn't make any claim that fishes are moral agents or anything like it.
We can't blame them.
But I think they're clearly more patients. They suffer. And my sense is that we always attribute some level of moral decision when suffering's involved.
Are you vegetarian?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
But I've killed a lot of animals.
And you're okay with killing animals in the future?
No. I've stopped killing monkeys.
But you eat them.
No, I don't eat the monkeys in particular.
But you eat animals.
Yes, I do, absolutely.
And
For
do you
lunch.
think this is morally consistent?
Morally consistent, yeah. Now, so here's the thing. I don't think there's a nice, neat dividing line. And in fact, sort of like Don's parents, I was perfectly okay to do monkey surgeries in which they die at the end of the process for years and years, because I had sort of been balancing and worrying about, what are the consequences, what are the good, balance the good against the bad and the disease stuff like that. I couldn't go back to doing it. So it's not, I didn't see a nice, neat, clear white line that said I'm crossing this line or not.
I think that philosophically there won't be, but then legally there has to be. So we have to do the best we can.
Right, so I've never done it on chimpanzees, and I don't think I ever would have.
And would you universalize this behavior? Would you make it illegal?
Which one?
You pick whichever one is most interesting.
Well, so Dan and I were at an interesting conference years ago in which we were struggling with the problem of transplantation. I spent, my career doing a lot of neural transplantation. About, what happens if I put chimpanzee neurons into human brains?
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa.
Which was the really interesting
Yeah,
case.
so the question is, when do we cross a moral line? It was actually very difficult to make that decision. We struggled. It's a whole group of us struggled with this, trying to make sense of it. And I think that kind of moral decision, there's this big gray area, and I just don't know where to.
I would have thought that this afternoon, we'd be talking about the mysterians' problems with consciousness, right? Why? You think it's like not even on the table anymore?
Define the problem for all.
Well, the problem of qualia, the problem of subjective experience, the what it's like to be a bat problem, the things, of course, that Dan has spent a lot of time fighting against for a long time, and in which we all appreciate that he's done the good. No, but it obviously it's like whack-a-mole. We've got Nagel again giving us this crap, and it's being taken seriously all over the place, right? Now,
we're all on the same
You might need to explain, Alex, what you're
Yeah, you probably ought to give the story quickly.
well, it's the idea that there are that there is a what it's like to be conscious that is incapable of being captured by third-person neuroscience, that there is an aboutness of human thought that is incapable of being realized by input-output neurological systems, and which provides to the mysterians the strongest basis for their rejection of materialism and naturalism. And
Or simply to say that science could never touch it.
yes,
So, but I thought, okay, that's an interesting point, because I actually thought through that we were gonna go at some point there. And my take on Nagel's paper, which I reread recently because of one of my classes.
Nagel's, I mean, what it's like.
What is it like?
Yeah, but he's
yeah.
just written a new book.
No, no,
in which
yeah, I
he's
know,
gone-
I know,
He's
I
upped
know.
the stakes.
I think we should, I think we should bracket the new book out, because it sounds, I haven't read it, I've read only 2 or 3 reviews of it, and it sounds really wacky. But so I want to hear what people think about the what is it like to be a bad thing. I took that, the message of that, I'm not saying that this is what Nagel intended, but I took that to say, not that the strong implication is that there's something somehow that science cannot touch or cannot explain or whatever it is about conscious experiences, quality and all that, but simply that if we want to apply the third-person scientific analysis to first-person experiences, we're making a category mistake. You know, no matter what how good your description and accurate your description is of the way the human brain works, you're not going to have that experience unless you are that brain. So we're never going to have the experience of being a bat. That doesn't mean we cannot understand how bats work. Is that not sensible?
Well,
That's not what Nagel.
No, that's what I'm saying, but is that not more sensible than what people have taken out of Nagel?
one problem with Nagel that is extremely frustrating is that a lot of people think that that's a paper that argues that we cannot know what it's like to be a bat. If you look closely, you realize he never argues for that. He assumes that we can never know what it's like to be a bat, and then he argues about what the implications of his premise are.
Right.
And that's a huge bit of misdirection right there. But then, there is a fundamental ambiguity in his paper, which I think I finally got to the bottom of. There's 2 senses in which you could be making the assumption that we cannot imagine what it's like to be a bat. One is, we just lack the pigments on our palate to imagine it because bats are so different from us. And the other is, whether or not we could imagine it, we could never confirm that we'd done it successfully. To compare, we could never imagine what the winning lottery number in tomorrow is. Well, yeah, you could, by accident. You just wouldn't know if you were right till the next day. So there's a question of whether it's confirming imagination or whether it's just not being able to render in imagination what it's like to be a bat. I think a lot of people think, because he's talking about bats, that he means the first. Because we don't have echolocation, because, so forth, we don't have the pigments in our palate. We just can't do it. But in fact, that's not what he means, or at least he abandons that, because I once put it to him point blank on Justice Point. I said, suppose you had a twin brother who was also a philosopher. Could you imagine what it's like to be him? If it's pigments, he should say, yeah, of course. He said no. Then what the heck is he talking about bats for?
Yeah, but he actually says that the problem, I'm just using bats as an example, but it's also true for us.
Well, but then notice that there's something like sleight of hand going on. Why does he bother stressing how alien bats are from us?
He thinks it's us.
If he could just as well be talking about an identical twin brother of him. And of course, there's another conflict in that paper, and that is, he goes on and on about bats. Why? Because presumably it's telling us something about what it's like to be a bat. And why wouldn't more of the same tell us more and more about what it's like to be a bat?
And Richard, of course, if he were here, would chime in that how furious he is at Nagel, because what Nagel took and put in that paper was developed by a well-known British bat scientist during World War II.
And, well, Kathy Akins and I went through the paper called "What It's Like to Be a Bat."
Told us.
Yes, right.
You can do it. I mean, the very premise of his paper is just wrong.
The reason I sort of feel like Dan tired about this, but sometimes things have to come back after you feel like you gave them up. But I think what Alex's point is important because it's part of the general thread he's trying to bring back this afternoon, I think, which is that many philosophers, actually some of them naturalists, so maybe this is a way to put it to get the interest of the room sort of focused, I mean, obviously if you're a Cartesian, you're a certain kind of mysterian, what Alex called, namely you're someone who thinks that the methods of the natural sciences will not reveal the nature of mind. You've got to use some other techniques for that because it's a non-physical substance, it has unusual causal powers, and so on and so forth. The people that I actually called, because I was the guy who named them, the New Mysterians, after a band from the late 60s called Question Mark and the Mysterians, wrote a song called 96 Tears, in case you're wondering.
And that was pretty much it.
That was pretty much it, exactly. They were one-hit wonders. And Dan and I both wish this. Colin McGinn, but you see it in Dave Chalmers, so the sort of person who's getting all the attention for telling us that there's this hard problem that we can never solve, so Colin McGinn's idea was that on the one hand he says, I'm a naturalist, it's got to be that the brain yields consciousness, but we will never ever be able to understand what the connection is. It's, as he put it, it's cognitively closed to us. The only way I ever got for understanding this would be if he had something like up his sleeve, like a Heisenberg uncertainty principle or a Gödel kind of result. Imagine some kind of formal limitative theorem. It could even have to do with, say, looping. I sometimes have thought about that, what Ian Hacken calls looping, because it's an interesting feature of persons that when we say things about ourselves, that changes the system, and things like that. But it really is just a kind of internal to a kind of analytic philosophy that pays no attention to science, just, as you, I think, said, an embarrassment to philosophy. Chalmers, meanwhile, seems to go the same route, I'm afraid. And this is a very smart man, and this is a cause of great trouble. The fact that he can do thought experiments of the sort where if he imagines his zombie self on Twin Earth, he's able to imagine the molecule-for-molecule replica that isn't conscious. And that, to him, somehow proves that materialism, depends on the version, I'm just giving a short Monarch Note version, is false, or physicalism is...
Non-philosophers can't take this out of the...
Yeah, so it's
already way out of the room.
The point is, it's a very peculiar form of argument, but what we need to know is that there are people who, unfortunately, there are representatives of our tribe who are not in this room, who take these forms of argument seriously and tell us that there's an unsolvable hard problem of consciousness, that there is nothing, I think, at least my view, and I think this is shared by Alex and Dan, and I'm really curious about if David agrees with it. At the end of the day, a theory of the conscious, just because philosophers started paying attention to a problem around 1990 again, then they feel like they should know whether it's solvable by the next Thursday. Well, what you need to do for something like consciousness is just figure out, let neuroscience and psychology develop, and then you'll find out things like what the causal role of consciousness is, how pervasive is it, how in touch with all the whole system is it, what kind of analysis do we need to give of it, is it where does it take place, what are the parts that act. But there's a lot of still a priori arguments in philosophy, and some of them do have implications for us, because the Cartesians will still have to believe that naturalism is a guaranteed to fail program, and the mysterians the naturalistic mysterians just think, sometimes they make metaphysical claims, sometimes they make purely epistemic claims, which is one way of reading, say, Nagel, which is to say that the third person perspective, of my brain while I'm talking, and they say, well, they're your experiences, Owen. I say, well, those aren't my experiences, those are representations of my experiences. And then we're supposed to go ooh and ah and say, how is it possible that those neural events are the experiences that I'm having? And it's very dependent on a set of intuitions, which I think also just go back to the legacy of Cartesianism and make us unnecessarily puzzled about something which, if we are naturalists, and I think of naturalism as the inference to the best explanation about the way the world works, then the best inferences are that my mental states are brain states, and it's up to empirical science to figure out the nature of the beast. And
so, can I put another problem on the table, or is it too late in the day?
It's not at all. Let me just parenthetically say that, so you're surprised that we weren't focusing on the Mysterian issue. That might be because everyone in the room agrees, and that might be because the people in the room were not randomly selected from any group other than people I wanted to have in the room. But go ahead.
I have a question after I also want to put a question on the table. Probably we're going to have to.
We'll change the subject.
Oh, you
Let's
change
forget
the
it.
subject, okay.
No, but Alex wanted.
No, go ahead. No, I don't want to change the
No,
subject.
finish, and then I will put the next
Okay,
issue.
very good. Sounds good. The question that I also thought it was gonna pop up this afternoon is, does anybody here in any strong sense think that consciousness is an illusion? And what do they mean by that?
Is what?
An illusion.
It depends on what, there's two
Well,
types.
right, and so what do you mean by that? Right.
The question is,
I
who's
think-
deluded?
I think it's an illusion in the sense that it isn't what everybody thinks it is. I don't think it, I mean, there is a reality of consciousness. I mean, it's like, to me, it's an illusion in the same sense as free will.
Could you elaborate on that? Because I don't.
There is no me in the brain that's self-aware, and like on a philosophical tyro. I mean,
No, that's fine.
I mean,
I'm trying to figure out
that our consciousness is simply an epiphenomenon, albeit one that might have been put there by natural selection, of a collation of neurons that we have that makes us feel that there is an agent inside our
Why
head.
epiphenomenon as opposed to phenomenon?
Well, it could be,
Is it super
okay, phenomenon, I mean, yeah. It could be, but it could be, I mean,
He means
epiphenomenon.
epiphenomenon in the legitimate sense, not in the philosophical sense, which is a non-star.
Well, that's what I wanted to actually figure out, because, no, I think there's an important distinction here. If we agree that it's a phenomenon, so for instance, let me try to clarify where I was going with this. So I've heard, not from people in this room, but the argument that, oh, well, we know that consciousness is an illusion because if you look at split brain patients, they have, sort of multiple and conflicting sort of desires and all that sort of stuff. To me, that shows nothing of the sort. It simply shows that when the brain doesn't work properly, as natural selection intended it, so to speak, then you get interesting phenomena, interesting phenomena of that sort, but it's a non-functional brain. It's a malfunctioning brain.
But look,
So it doesn't, hold on, let me
when
finish.
you're having a dream, you also don't know what's going on. There's parts of your brain that
Sure.
are surprising other parts of your
Sure,
brain.
sure.
So, yeah, I don't think you have to go to non-functional to say that.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that it seems to me, especially from a purely naturalistic perspective, that we don't need to do anything like denying consciousness in any, let's say the consciousness is an illusion in any strong sense of the word. All we need to say is, yeah, of course it comes out of parts underlying it, just like the functioning of a car comes out of parts underlying it, and if you break the steering wheel, it's not going to work anymore. It's going to do something bizarre, right? You wouldn't say that the car going straight is an illusion because when you take the wheels apart, it doesn't happen anymore, right? So yes, it's made of parts. It's an emergent property in the weak sense in this case, or an epiphenomenal in the strong sense. I don't know which way you want to go. I think a phenomenon, it's probably better. So that's what I wanted to know, if people actually in this room agree with that, as opposed to sort of what I sometimes think of as a facile, oh, the split brain shows that it's all an illusion, therefore there's no me. Well, there is you in an interesting sense of you, biologically, evolutionarily, in terms of decision-making and moral responsibility, if you want to go back to the earlier discussion. But of course that you comes out of pieces that interact in certain ways, and the job of neurobiologists, among other things, is to figure out how exactly these pieces interact to yield you.
Let's add, if you want to talk about this me and you business.
Not too much, but yeah.
So, the existence of me, this self that is so important to me, crucially, I need stuff besides what's in my brain for that, right? I have to build a whole bunch of, I have to hang a bunch of scaffolding out in the environment, right, to keep myself on track and to be able to sort of re-identify myself and remind myself of the constraints that I'm trying to respect. And I also need other people to give me feedback that tells me that I'm staying on track, and so on and so on. And so, right? So we get into all, when we're talking, once we're dealing with the self, we invite all sorts of pseudo problems, and we also invite lots of really naive eliminativism from neuroscientists. Agreed. By thinking, but by trying to get that whole self inside the skull cavity.
Sure, I just want to ask a brief question. If your consciousness is an epiphenomenon, how could it be a product of natural selection?
Oh, let me characterize the two different senses of epiphenomenon.
Okay. Oh, I didn't know. Okay.
Oh, completely distinct. One of them is a
Type one and
perfectly
type
good
two.
concept, and the other one, anybody who uses it, as a philosopher once said to me, I should wear a paper bag over my head if I use that concept. I said yes. So all right. The original meaning of epiphenomenon, and it was Huxley that coined the term, and his example was the whistle of a steam engine. And he didn't mean the toot toot, he meant the escaping steam whistle of the steam engine, which makes a noise. It's a perfectly good phenomenon, it's just not functional. It's not a part of the function of the steam engine. It is a byproduct.
Its effects make no contribution to what
It makes no contribution to the running of the steam engine. And that was that was the psychologists and sort of, that was the sense that was originally picked up. So epiphenomenon.
And that was the one that William James called an unwarrantable impertinence in the current state of psychology. So Huxley, he quotes Huxley.
So basically that is, it's a phenomenon that has effects but doesn't have any functions. So if you paint the connecting rods of your engine bright red, that's epiphenomenal. Has plenty of effects. You can take pictures of it. It reflects different light and so forth. There's nothing mysterious about it. It just doesn't play any role. The philosophers came along, and I don't know who's responsible for this.
C.D. Broad.
And said an epiphenomenon is an effect of physical causes which itself has no effects. No effects at all. And that notion is simply incoherent nonsense, because if it has no effects, then
How do you know
its,
about
But
it?
absolutely
its
crucial to another
disappearance would
mysterian.
make no difference.
But absolutely
so-
crucial to another mysterian argument against
So let me just quickly, so both of those epiphenomena, okay, there's the rubbish one, so dump it,
Throw it
right?
away.
So the
Now we have the other one.
psychological one, the Huxley one,
Yeah.
if it has no functional effect on the brain, how could it be a product of natural selection? If
It would be a
It's
byproduct.
carried along as a
well,
free
you just said
rider.
it was. You just said it was an epiphenomenon that was a product of natural selection. And maybe I just,
I think it is, but I can't.
The sound of the heart beating is similar to this. The heart beats because it makes sound because it's a physical thing, takes up space.
There's no way to beat without making sound.
Something
like the heart beating, the sound of the heart.
No, I'm not claiming, I'm just trying to give the example. No, that's okay, I'm not there.
I wouldn't think so, but, you know.
No, that answers Simon.
well, I don't think so. So nothing selected the sound of the heart beating.
Right.
That's correct, that's correct.
And so,
Look, what I meant is it could be a byproduct of natural selection.
A byproduct.
And that
Like
our
the
feeling
sound
of
of the
agency
heartbeat,
might not be
sure.
selected
okay,
for.
that's fair. I'm sorry, it's a
I
semantic
have an
problem.
undergraduate question. I mean, you're talking about, the functioning and these byproducts that come out of the functioning, but particularly in the steam engine, I mean, that byproduct actually is a really important part of the continued function of the engine, because if you don't release that steam, it explodes. So byproducts are
release,
part of
it's
the
the sound,
process
it's
in
the
a
hissing
bigger
sound.
macro kind of sense, right?
But the point is, if you muffled the sound, you wouldn't hurt anything at all if you did it right.
It's the sound, it's
The
not the
sound
release.
is, it's not just the releasing steam, it's the sound.
Okay, the sound, thank you, that's a
In
very
the
helpful
same sense as
distinction.
beat of the heart.
And I mean, you could also make the
yeah.
case that building a brain that did everything that we wanted to do and also didn't produce a feeling of consciousness would just be much harder. So do the simpler thing and just have this.
Well, there's that
consciousness.
possibility,
Yeah.
there's lots of possibilities.
Guys, for those of you who are not following us on Twitter, somebody just tweeted the following. In honor of Move Naturalism, here are some bat embryos and what is it like to be a bat by Anatomical. And there's a picture of 3 bat embryos that this guy has posted.
Yeah.
It's linked to our discussion, so.
It's like-
They're really cute, they're little white ones.
That's right.
I thought it was cute. Anyway, sorry. Back to the discussion.
Alex, you should change this up.
Yeah, so
Yes.
Change this up.
the other problem that we naturalists face, and it goes back to the discussion of meaning, is a naturalistic account of semantic meaning. And naturalists have been working for at least 50 years on this subject, and with no interesting agreed-upon consensus. And here there is a divide of which Terry represents a significant path. If we assume that the intentionality of written inscriptions and vocal disturbances in the air is due to the intentionality, the original intentionality of brain states, then we need an account of how brain states can represent, can be semantically evaluable, can have truth values, can express propositions via some kind of inscriptional devices. And at least so far, we have not had a entirely satisfactory account of how that's possible. And my own view, which stems from reading a book called Content and Consciousness a long time ago, is that owing to the fact that our brains are Darwinian systems, we will never have such an account. Now,
That's not
let me finish. Now, let me just
Not in that book.
let me. Well, I didn't say that it was in the book. I said it was owing to my reading it. But of course, there are those who say, like Terry, that the mistake in this identification of the problem stems from the idea that the meaning of speech and inscriptions is derived from the meaning of brain states, and that meaning exists independently of brain states.
The last part is not what I would say.
Oh, okay.
No, absolutely, without brain state, there's no meaning. But what I think the real problem is this identification of a thought with a brain state. Yes, our brain is going through lots of things, doing lots of things, but I would view...
The meaningful content of a thought.
That's right. So the meaningful content of a thought, I don't think is... That's the identity theory that I'm troubled by. The identity theory says, and we can do it in all different ways, that I have brain state A and that's thought B. My view of that is that that's a mistake. I think that the brain state is like the words he's typing on his computer. It represents something, but that representation is not the brain state.
Yeah.
That is, the content, or you might say the aboutness, is not the brain state. The brain state is a medium. And just like the words typed on a computer or the sounds I'm making, that the reference of that, the meaning of that, is not that. So,
Alex, do you deny externalism?
Yes.
Sorry.
You deny externalism? Okay. We're going to have to explain that, I know, to not.
yes, you will.
So, I think it's really, really important if we're going to talk about, and it does matter to consciousness, right? I mean, it's, I was getting at it in my remark a few minutes ago about needing scaffolding to construct a self. But the externalism about semantic meaning is a little bit simpler, right? It's the idea that the meaning of a word, or the meaning of anything, is a function of coordination among agents who use those devices to represent information to one another. And so part of the identity condition, part of the meaning conferring
by invoking
conditions.
the word represent, you have engaged in a regress, which you will now have to cash in.
Okay, fair enough. Sure. But, so let's park that and agree that it must be done. But we use various devices for coordinating our expectations with one another. And that coordination of expectations is itself an information sharing and conveying process. And we depend on all sorts of external environmental conditions being right, some of which we also manipulate. I mean, we maintain the environmental conditions so as to maintain the stability of the conventional signs that we use. That's true of words, it's true of all the components of natural language. We of course convey information, we use a lot besides language, right? We have conventional gestures, but we also have the social structures that we build and code all kinds of information and guide us and constrain the way we'll interpret one another. Lots of our institutional trappings are like that.
That's another word you're going to have to cash in, interpret.
Which one?
Interpret,
yeah. Okay.
Because that's just another intentional term.
But now, okay, so but first, the key externalist point is, right, a brain state of me regarded as just with respect to its physiological properties or its neurochemical properties, doesn't in itself have any stable meaning or reference, though the existence of various states of that kind will be necessary conditions for my producing things that in some community of information sharers have meaning and reference and other semantic properties.
Externalism is simply obviously true of something like bank balances.
Absolutely.
There's no money. Looking at the computer program, looking at the data structure of the computer, and saying, how on the earth can this be money? You're never going to see it if you look locally. You have to see the role it's playing in the larger system. Then it's obvious.
But now Alex says we must crash it.
I mean, I'm going to definitely need an undergraduate version here. Because so now tell me how this story works for something like or. Like or. Or X or.
Syntactic grammatic terms.
Oh.
So this is a story that works actually I don't think it works at all, but it works for cat, maybe. But how does it work for something like or?
All right, let me try.
In the undergraduate version, though, not
Okay.
without the verbiage and the.
All right. You come across somebody in the supermarket and you see they have a shopping list in their hand. They're going down, and the third thing on the list says cheddar or brie. Okay. And you decide, well, this probably means get either some cheddar or some brie. And sure enough, that's what it means. And the or there has intentionality, it has meaning, in virtue of the role it plays in the shopper's activities. So if it weren't the shopper having the activities, then or wouldn't mean a damn thing. You don't look at the ink, that's not where it is. You have to see how or is playing the role, not just on the piece of paper, but in the whole system of the projects of the shopper. Now, very simple. Rip up the list and put it in the shopper's head. Same story. The states in the brain have their meaning because they are being used by the person who is the shopper. A shopping list in the head is derived intentionality just as much as a shopping list on a piece of paper.
And once we admit all that, which does seem very reasonable to me, I might be being way too naive here, but it doesn't seem hard to me to figure out how meaning, in that sense, arises through natural selection. I mean, I would say that if that's true, then we can say that a certain group of genes represents blue eyes or brown eyes, right? And guess what? That can be selected for and it can grow, and then more complicated things can appear in the brain, and there's a little part of my brain that represents seeing a shark or seeing a dolphin, and there's another part of my brain that represents I should run away from this, or I should shake hands with this, or whatever, and I can see that growing through natural selection. But clearly there's more to it than that, so maybe you should tell me why that I need to know more.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, you don't need to know much more. That's pretty
how do
much.
you feel
I mean,
about
Alex,
Alex is.
it's true that it's. Sorry, we do have one more thing to do, and I'm sorry, we do need some verbiage, I'm afraid, right? I mean, I don't know how we're supposed to express complicated ideas without sometimes having to use some slightly complicated descriptions.
That's okay.
So,
This is just talked about fermions.
yeah. So look,
Fair enough.
so Alex, it's true that my attempt to sort of generally explicate the externalist story, as Alex pointed out, I used two semantic terms, and they do need to be cashed out. But it seems to me representation carries quite a lot less semantic baggage than meaning or reference. And so if there is systematic, if there's systematic response in my behavior mediated through other systematic processes in my brain, and that strongly co-vary with syntactic changes in the various linguistic entities that we use for information exchange, and there's also, of course, covariance. Those covariance patterns are repeated to people with whom my interlocutors. All that systematic covariance just is representation. That's the basis of representation.
If you want a simpler version that avoids the term representation, I highly recommend the recent book by my colleague Ray Jackendoff called A User's Guide to Thought and Meaning, which summarizes, and his book, Foundations of Language, is, I think, a masterpiece, but it's a very hard masterpiece to work your way through.
Easy masterpieces, thanks.
So, his book, The User's Guide to Thought and Meaning, is his inquiry. Hume wrote the treatise, very difficult, nobody read it. Then he wrote the inquiry to get people to pay attention, and they did. Ray's written The User's Guide, and it is clear as a bell, and he's extracted it from all of the infighting with the Chomskyians. All of that stuff is just canceled out. It's not there. And he just lays out a view which looks at what has to happen so that language can have meaning. And he points out that philosophical theories that don't go through the psychology and the neuroscience and the brain are tying both hands behind their back. Here's a parallel that some people will get right away, and I might really like. Think about Evo-Devo in biology. What do the Evo-Devo people say? They say, oh, you evolutionary biologists, you go immediately one step from the gene to the phenotype. You leave out all the Devo stuff, and that just isn't good because the Devo stuff makes a huge difference. And a lot of evolutionary psychologists say, well, you know, we thought we could sort of finesse all that Devo stuff, and we really can do the mapping directly from the gene to the phenotypic features. Well, there's differences of opinion about that, but there seems to be a lot of truth in Devo. Now, here's what Ray's doing. He's saying to the philosophers who have their semantic model theories, which go right from the word to the world, he says, you're leaving the brain out. You can't leave the brain out. You got to go from the world to the brain, to the word to the brain to the world. And if you try to leave the brain out, you'll never succeed in telling the story well. And then he takes the brain and he articulates what the specs have to be. What does the brain have to do? And it's not. David reminded me of this the first day, yesterday, when he was talking about how the brain scientists sort of don't have the vocabulary even to talk about the high levels of what the brain is doing. And this, of course, goes back to David Marr, who also said you got to know what the problems are that the brain is solving. Ray's book is an attempt to list the specs for a working brain that can talk about its world in terms that are amenable to modeling in the brain soon. You know, it's not source code yet.
Should we demand as a criterion of satisfaction for a naturalistic account of meaning that it provide us with a translation manual from a particular set of neural firings to a particular semantic content where that manual does not itself contain any intentional vocabulary?
Well, I think you can get very close, although the intentional vocabulary is a good crutch. Ray tries to do it.
And you understand why someone would want an intention-free vocabulary, especially if one was a naturalist, in order to avoid allowing for opportunities for mystery monger.
Well, but notice that there is a divide and conquer strategy which temporizes. That's the one I described yesterday. It's homuncular functionalism. It says, look,
if homuncular functionism pans out, bottoms out into totally stupid homunculi, we are home free.
Exactly. But it may be that using intentional language to characterize the mid-level areas.
That's gonna be
would
okay,
just-
provided it
Yeah,
bottoms out.
Bottoms
Right.
out, well, that's the whole point.
Right, and
That's the
now,
whole point, yeah.
the problem that I put on the table was the prospect that it might not bottom out, and that we therefore,
that's
as
always a prospect,
naturalists, need to begin to treat meaning the way the way you have admitted we can treat free will.
So as somebody who's
Not as a
spent-
fact about the furniture of reality, but as a device that we employ for social control.
So.
Oh, wait, I want to hear how Dan responds to this. It's really important to my personal philosophy and, to how am I going to sleep at night as a naturalist.
I think there are many phenomena that can be described, many regularities in the manifest image that can be described, discovered, and that can baffle us, that we can describe them in non-intentional language entirely, and we can be absolutely mystified about why these regularities are regularities, and the only way we will ever succeed in showing why they are the regularities they are is if we use intentional language. So
intentionality is emergent.
Intentionality is the only way to explain phenomena that we can see right in front of our eyes are real and reliable and robust. And the only way they can be explained is by adopting. I gave you the example of the Laplacian demon that is puzzled about how this person interacting with a telephone can make the same prediction. Because there seems to be information is going from point A to point B, but in order to make that explanation, you have to use intentional language.
So-
you have to talk about some things being representations of other things.
But what if, just to really quickly, sorry, Matt.
No, that's okay.
Very quickly, so what if it doesn't bottom out and you're also correct?
Then we've got a real crisis, I guess. If it really
I would
doesn't
agree.
bottom
I just
out,
want to make
yeah.
sure I understood
No,
that.
I think that would be a real crisis.
But it's early days to declare one.
But
It's early days to declare
Yeah,
one.
right.
absolutely.
Absolutely right. I think that's very important to
No, I
recognize.
think it is.
We've only been trying since Peirce.
Yeah.
And Peirce was really got us on the.
Doesn't Terry give us something a little closer to the bottoming out story in symbolic species, right? Because, right, we've got to get, notice, all I need now to satisfy Alex, right? We've got a notion of representation that's more innocent than reference, right? But it's still intentional. So we've got to figure out now how we can tell a mechanical story to get something going on between the tracking system in the representing organ, the brain, and those physical tokens out there that we use for coordination, words, for example, or sentences. Now, I take it, key part of the story in symbolic species is to tell us what happened, right, in the development of phylogeny of the brain,
Of the human brain.
Yes.
brain that established that basic ground floor representational capacity.
And Terry's story relies on emergentism.
Yes, no, but let me say that what I wanted to say is that I spent my career struggling with this question. My last 10 years, I said, the question that's below this is your question. That is, can I do this without intentional talk? And this is why I've moved down to a question about origins of life. About what I would say is, how is it that I can ascribe information to a molecule? We do it all the time.
Yeah,
and how can you build that up?
And in your description, you helped yourself to this word representation.
No, I don't. I want to be clear that
didn't
my
yesterday?
look, I'm doing a shortcut here. Okay, but the real question is, I want to take the concept of information that we've taken from a very simple sense of information and to build it up big enough so we can talk about this notion of reference or aboutness, however you want to call it, and significance or the normativity feature of it. I think you can only do it by using the Shannonian model and amplifying it with the concept of work. And I think it's basic. I'm not sure we're going to get to this.
If that succeeds, that will answer my question.
I know it.
With
That's what I'm
Shannon Weaver information plus Newton's
So, no, let me just
is
walk you
totally non-intentional.
So let me just walk you through a little piece of it, so you get a sense of what I'm
Maybe
after.
we don't have time now. but-
Okay, no, I won't give you the whole question, but the simple question I asked is, for Shannon, information, there's the original entropy of a signal, and then there's what he calls the message entropy. And if the message entropy is lower than the original entropy, the possibilities of signal, you have some reduction of uncertainty. That's his measure. But what he and others have recognized, he doesn't go on to talk about it, because, in fact, to quantify, you don't want to go any further than that. You get lost, because how many possible references could there be? You know, this is just sort of, you might say, the ground. But as Charles Bennett would say, all media, all information is physical. If a medium has changed its entropy, that is, it's not spontaneous, it's dropped in its entropy, work had to have been done. It has to be an open system. So when I can say that the loss of entropy of a signal is about something else, it carries its aboutness in its constraint. And that aboutness is telling me about work that is not that signal. It is something else in that signal. And that's how we can use, so when I use the arrangement of chairs in this room to tell me about something, if it's in a low probability state, I know, that is, if they're all turned upside down on their bottoms, for example, I know that work has been done on that. And by virtue of the nature of that unusual constraint, I have some clues as to what kind of work was there. What else is there besides the stuff? And that's the ground of the aboutness. It has to be the ground of the aboutness.
I think I agree with you.
It's like understanding when we find hieroglyphics about which we know nothing, we can tell there's got to be a decoding, right? And if we're clever enough, we'll even find it as long as we've got enough samples, right?
Well, and we got to find other correlates, of course. That's not enough. This is just, so Shannon is telling you what's necessary to have any information. No. And the next question is, what's necessary to have any aboutness, any reference? That's still not the interpretation story that you're after. But there's a couple of others. Yeah, the final piece is, what do we say when I've got something that represents something to me, but it's not information, not useful in the broad sense? We say that it doesn't help me reduce any of the work I need to do. My favorite example is a jigsaw puzzle that's upside down. You have no constraints except the shape. You do a lot more work, but if you turn it up right side up with the picture, you have more constraint. And that means you do less work. What I gained from having those constraints was that I saved work. And my sense is that the whole story can be told through that way. And once you begin doing that, you've left the story of intentionality, but you've derived, in a physical sense, what's accomplished by intentionality. Now, that's my 5-minute spiel on it, but basically what I'm trying to say is I think we can do it. I don't want it to be mysterian, like you're saying.
And thus will we gradually pull Alex back to naturalism.
Alex, it strikes me that this discussion you guys just had may have at least a partial analogy with the discussion that I think Dan and Jerry were having yesterday about using teleological terms, let's say, in evolutionary biology. It seems to me that you're really bothered by the use of intentional language terms. When you say you want to get rid of them in order to have an explanation that is based on physical? Is that not
No.
correct? Okay, well then.
I was demanding that they bottom out.
They bottom out, okay, fine. So, didn't we go through a similar story in evolutionary biology where we have an interesting concept there, that there is a concept of things being for, certain traits, organismal traits are for something, they are teleological. But of course that teleology doesn't imply any mysterianism, it doesn't imply any God designed things that way and all that sort of stuff. It is the result of a series of physical processes, right? But
I got off that train a long time before it got to the station you just described. That's my problem. I already understand, and partly I understand from the work of Dan, from Content and Consciousness, and from Jonathan Bennett, Linguistic Behavior, that meaning is ultimately teleological. And that's my big problem, because once I recognize that there is no teleology, I'm pretty well committed to the claim that there is no meaning.
But why are you committed to the claim there's no teleology?
Because there's only blind variation and environmental filtration. And this brings us back to an issue that we talked about 24 hours ago, right? The question of, the glass half empty or half full. Did Darwin make purpose safe for naturalism, or did he expunge it from the naturalist's universe? And I think he did the latter, and Dan thinks he did the former.
So I'm correct that there is an analogy there, that it does go, right, it does go to a question of teleology, so it's similar to the discussion we were having yesterday, and since I accept teleology.
More than an analogy.
It's the actual question, it's the actual thing.
Yeah.
And so I don't seem to be as bothered by what bothers you, because I actually do accept teleology. I don't think Darwin did anything like that.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that clarifies things for me, at least. Okay.
Except that if we can get meaning, if we can get intentionality to ground out in your way.
Yeah, that would circumvent this problem. See,
That's right.
The
we get around
analysis
it.
of why we're going to fail that I give has to do with that. But I'm prepared to, and in fact, I will be the first to stand up and salute when the program achieves its goal.
Right.
And I think it's important for the philosophy of naturalism. In fact, it's one of the most important components of that.
Yeah.
But now I'm confused, because I thought you had said that Darwin had showed, that you think they're the same result. So that is, Darwin got rid of teleology, and therefore he got rid of all intentionality, including aboutness
Yeah.
in the way that we require it. So don't you, it sounds like you
No, so-
now have grounds for.
No.
saying it's-
So if we can provide an alternative account of intentionality
Yeah.
that doesn't involve teleology, then I'll be prepared to buy it. And if we can provide an account, if someone can convince me that I'm just wrong about the nature of reality, that there really are purposes out there, they're just what Darwin, in my view, substituted for them, then that'll work.
See, the reason a story like Terry's is going to be crucial here
Yeah.
is because when, one of the original naturalistic accounts of meaning, right, had this problem, the so-called problem of error, right? If something means something, you've got to be able to say under what conditions it might be, it might be used wrongly.
The disjunction problem, as Flangan calls it.
And in the 80s, one of the standard ways in which people tried to solve that, to solve that problem of error was, and this is Alex's question begging really, because one of the ways people tried to solve that error was by so-called teleosemantics, that is by
and the
referring
art of
to
teleosemantics
proper
is
function.
content consciousness.
And but that's also why if Terry can convince Alex that a story like his does the trick, right? Then we don't need teleosemantics to solve the question-begging teleosemantics to solve the problem of error. So now we've got naturalized meaning. Now it doesn't matter how now the question about how to read Darwin really is just a question of what to say, right? Because then you could look at Darwin from upside down or look at Darwin right side up. It doesn't matter anymore, right? And we brought Alex back from the cliff.
Kierkegaard says about cliffs, sometimes you don't know whether or not you're scared because you're going to fall or you're scared because you're going to jump. I think Alex jumped in his last book. But I actually am getting a little confused by some of this now too, like Rebecca. So what's wrong with saying, back to what's real, humans have purposes, for example. I mean, psychological purposes. So it's a perfectly legitimate psychological phenomenon. What's that?
You can't say that humans have purposes unless you're prepared to give an account of how humans represent that bottoms out in a non-intentional account.
I'm going more simply than you.
Okay.
I'm just saying it's part of the manifest image that humans have purposes, like humans have values and humans have intentions, not semantic ones. And then, and we use language to represent, and language has meaning. These just seem like the phenomena that one ought not to eliminate. And I get puzzled by when you say things like that it sometimes sounds like the fact that Peirce and Coyne didn't give us a satisfactory theory of naturalistic meaning. I mean, first of all, they didn't have neuroscience, and it seems that you still want us to eliminate or reduce intentionality, whereas the Jackendorf project is to explain it. And that seems very different to me. Am I still wrong? In other words, it just seems to me that,
an
for example,
explanation is fine with me, provided the explanation doesn't beg the question by invoking intentional notions.
Doesn't sneak any homunculus in there.
It doesn't put any undischarged among them.
Yes,
Undischarged,
right,
exactly.
undischarged.
right, but are you willing to wait and see now, follow Rebecca's idea that we're early in this and?
I think that you do not do Quine sufficient credit by suggesting that it was his or everyone's ignorance of neuroscience back then that led him to the doctrine of radical interpretation.
Well, one of the things that we get, I think we're just going to leave the non-philosophers behind here. The radical indeterminacy of radical interpretation.
Yes. I did think twice before saying it. It was the shorthand for answering Owen. So there's Quine has this wonderful. Well, you're the student of that.
Sorry, let me add one more thing just to get the historical picture complete. Right? It's quick. I'm not going to say anything about the indeterminacy. A really important book that nobody read in the late 80s, right? Which exactly made the point about how you need how you need a Terry type story. You need to rescue teleosemantics from being question begging. Was Dan Lloyd's book Simple Minds?
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
Sure.
I agree.
That was there. All the
statement of the program.
teleosemanticists have read that book. It's great. In any case, I don't know that we want to go.
I think
there.
I had second thoughts about trying to characterize. Well, it might be possible to do it dead simple. First, let me compare two views, and you can see if you can see the difference. My view with Fodor's. Fodor says, if you want to know whether something is a believer, look in its head and see whether or not its brain states represent beliefs.
Beliefs intentionally.
Yeah, that is so. If you want to, the question is, is this a believer? Is that a believer? Is he a believer? Am I? Where are the believers here? He says, look in the head and see if the states of the brain represent beliefs. If yes, you got a believer. If no, no. I say just the opposite in a certain way. I say, if you want to know whether states in the brain represent beliefs, see whether or not they are in the head of a believer. And you have to see what a believer is in order to understand how the states in that brain can represent things like the shopping list and so forth. And so that the concept of the intentional system is prior to the concept of the belief, because beliefs are states of intentional systems.
And Quine's point, which gets elaborated and taken over by Jerry, who thinks it's his own, is that there is no unique sentence that can be attributed to the belief state of the believer, no matter how much we know about the believer's behavior.
That's not right. Quine's view is that we could have two theorists, two observers, who take Don. They study him left, right, and sideways. They both consider him an intentional system. They both consider his brain to have states that they can interpret as beliefs. However, there's always a theoretical possibility that they might arrive at different Rosetta Stones for his brain. They might arrive at different catalogs of beliefs for Don's brain, and in the limit, there would be no question about one of them being right and one of them being wrong. There simply would be no fact of the matter, and the important thing to recognize...
It's not an epistemic point.
The important thing to remember about this is that he's not saying this is a practical problem, he's saying it's an in principle possibility. In the actual world, we don't have to worry about this because, a word Terry likes, the constraints are so overwhelmingly large that the chances of two observers ever coming up with significantly different translation manuals for his brain states is essentially zero.
The fineness of grain that we need for interacting with one another does not require us to individuate beliefs down to unique propositions.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But that is a point about practicalities of life.
Well,
Can I ask a
and
couple
you,
of simple
as we were
definitional
bef-
questions? Can I ask a couple of simple definitional questions that might help the rest of us?
You're the undergraduate again?
I'm the undergraduate,
Okay.
yeah, I like that, actually. Wish I could always be the undergraduate. First, what does it mean to represent something? I think I know, but I'm asking what I should know. And second, does to represent something, is that different than to mean something?
First of all, the big question, you asked the big R question, of course.
So the answer to the second point is that representing is a component of meaning, but it's not sufficient. Okay. However, once we get representing, we're a long way to get to having meaning.
Yeah.
And
What does it mean?
and representing is when one configuration of matter is about another configuration of matter. So here's a configuration of matter, okay? And you generally will interpret it as about another configuration of matter or an acoustical disturbance, you know, the letter of the alphabet, Y, and various configurations of matter that realize that letter of the alphabet, okay? But of course, if it's a tree whose branches have been knocked off by lightning, and which is just sitting there burned out by the side of the road, it doesn't represent, even though it's a configuration of matter, the letter Y.
I'm not sure that moving from defining representing in terms of being about is telling me anything.
Well, we can't, the whole problem is that we can't cache the aboutness of representation into a purely physical relation between configurations of matter.
Except by reference.
And now, Dan and Terry want to say, and the demand that we do so represents a fundamental mistake about the nature of meaning and the program of understanding human thought and speech, right?
So what is the daylight between representing and meaning?
Well, let me give you a sense.
Okay, well.
So this could be an orbit, right? This could be an orbit. It can represent the movement of a planet around something. It doesn't mean the movement of a planet around something, right? It's iconic. It's like it in some sense. It's got some homomorphisms with what I want to provide. We don't say that has meaning. But when I use the word, I describe these words to describe it to you, then you'll say it has meaning. It's a special subset of representing.
In some context, some communicative.
Yeah, and one of the things, the problem with the term meaning is that we, of course, brought it out of language. And we sometimes want to apply it to a domain that's bigger than language. And I think we get in trouble when we try to do that. And I think that's a real challenge.
Sorry, before anybody leaves, I need to let people know that the dinner reservations are actually for 8.
8, okay.
And we should call it pretty soon.
Right. And when I point to something, I can refer to it with my pointing, but it doesn't mean it. And I want to be clear that one of the problems when we expand out, the concept of meaning gets us into trouble. And I think we want to back away from it. And only use it in the special sense and when we're talking about something that has sort of linguistic or symbolic kind of features to it. So what I'm just trying to say is just beware of that overgeneralization.
Use it in the clearly defined places. Yeah.
But even in the semantic sense, it's problematic.
Oh, absolutely, yes, right.
Yeah.
But at least we have some hope.
As a second undergraduate here. So what does cat mean for you? What does cat or fish or table mean?
Cat means histidine.
I mean, since you're talking about meaning as if you had an implicit theory of what meaning is. Now, I guess I'd like to know.
Well, there's a number, obviously, a number of
so
ways to talk about
what do you
meaning.
know? Yeah, but let's pick one so that we can. So what is it that you know when you know the word cat, for instance?
Right. Well, first of all, you got a reference that'll go with it.
Do you need one?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You have to have at least a relative reference. That is the classic notion of a semantic network. A cat identifies a position in a semantic network in which you've got animals, you've got dogs, you've got chairs. It's a position there, and it has to refer to it. But by itself, it does not refer to anything in the world.
It means something by virtue of being in a network with other meanings.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
not.
yeah,
That's
yes,
not.
that's
well,
about
that's-
it. That's about it.
So-
Now, it's important to realize that there are a few people in our world who don't agree. Fodor famously thinks that, as he has put it, there could be an organism that had exactly one belief. That it believed, I don't know, the snow is white. Punkt. And that this would be the true because there would be a state in that organism's nervous system that meant snow is white, independently of everything else that just intrinsically meant it. Now, for us, this is preposterous. We can't make sense of that at all. We think the only way you could believe that snow is white is by A, knowing what snow is and knowing what white is and having the conceptual and perceptual equipment to partition the world into the parts that were snow and the parts that were white and the parts that weren't snow and the parts that weren't
Well, and
white.
having a,
So you can't know only one thing about snow.
and having an apparatus that allows you to do composition.
Exactly. So,
Which is, I'm not, it's not a freebie,
so
right? I mean,
we think
It's-
that meanings, the only hope of a theory of meaning is going to be one which looks at what we might call shorthand network properties. Now, Fodor has a name for this. He calls it meaning holism. And he's written a whole book attacking it.
Yeah.
Don't bother reading that book. Well, go ahead. Go ahead and read it, and you can find out how wrong we all are. So there are people that disagree with this.
Okay, but I'm still, I guess I'm still unsatisfied in an undergraduate sense. All you've said is it's in a network. Now tell me more about what that network actually contains. Is it just, for instance, a listing of features?
No,
I mean,
no.
well, it's, okay, so maybe you can develop the concept a bit more,
Well,
a bit more
there are
richly.
theories.
There's a physical configuration of matter in your head, okay? And that physical configuration of matter bears certain physical relations to a lot of other configurations of matter that are outside of your head. And that particular set of physical configurations of matter is what constitutes the meaning of cat.
Who thinks that the physical configurations have to do this?
Yeah.
Well, how else is going to happen?
Well, I mean, so you could mean unicorn, right?
Yeah, I mean,
So, first
Maybe-
off,
wait, wait, so let me just follow up a little bit here. So on the undergraduate notion, right? I can maybe see a network which is cat plays a certain like lexical role and it's related to other objects in my meaning space. So when I say cat is like horse, this can make sense to me. There's a correlational aspect presumably too to meaning.
Sure.
that's right. But
Okay.
but it doesn't.
But what
produce meaning.
but what's correlated? I mean,
Well, all right,
we're
well,
using
then,
all this,
let's-
what's
let's
actually,
take-
let's, you know,
Yeah,
so
let's
I have
take
to
a
actually
simple-
figure out what kind of experiment shows me
Right.
what's in your
Right,
head.
let's-
What,
let's take
and
a
that's
simple
actually,
case.
that's not like
That's
falling
good.
off a truck.
Yeah,
That means I have to make commitments
Yeah.
to a representational set of primitives, right? So I have to adopt a particular position on, let's say in this case, lexical semantics, not compositional semantics. So I actually do this sort of thing, and I'm completely unmoved by, it's in a network. That's not an account. That's not even descriptively adequate.
So first of all, I think my whole view on this is that we're talking at way too high a level. And even as a neuroscientist, I think that, we're in big trouble because we've got all of these unknowns, and it's such a huge monster. And for me, I basically have given that story up until I can tell the low story. I don't even want to go there for all of those reasons, even though I spent a good part of my career trying to do that. I think we're so confused about it for exactly the reasons you're asking. And this is the question about verification, about whether verification works, whether correlation is enough, whether being in a network is enough. Obviously, there's some kinds of referential relationships, like pointing, that don't need to have any network features to them, but yet they provide this feature. One of the questions really is there a kind of internal pointing behavior that's going on in the network? Is the network not just some sort of abstraction, but is it actually a kind of internal pointing behavior? I actually think it is, kind of vector kind of system. Now, I don't think I can cash that out in the way you would like, nor that I would like. I've been wanting to do it for a generation. But I think we can work our way up to it. And I think that's the problem.
There's-
I mean, I think so too. I'm relentlessly optimistic about this, but I think that staying at the extremely abstract level of discussion is just unhelpful.
Yeah.
I think it's actually time to cash out
We need
particular
to do
proposals.
this in the appraisal.
And the pleasure would be great, or, I mean, look.
But remember, we
That's the
were
seesaw.
reluctant.
Yeah.
We didn't bring up this overly abstract network stuff, right? We were talking about meaning, and we were using meaning as different from
Dan
representation.
appealed to the network as that's what it is, it's being in a network.
No,
And
but
for me,
you,
that's-
but only in
That was
response, only in response to the
particular question
request.
to you, yeah.
To the request that we say why we think meaning is more than representation, that's all, right?
But now let's have something, I mean, but, you know, now we're on a roll, right? So now
Well,
we can
let's- I mean,
we
look,
can get to the
Let's
scientific
talk
image.
about- Let's talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's get away from the manifest image of meaning.
Let's talk about ecclesia, let's talk about ecclesia for a bit.
2
We
foot
think-
long sea slug with neurons so big, you can, with a magnifying glass, you can locate them and you can see what's going on molecular,
And they
in the
have mapped
molecular
out-
biology of the genetic,
Yeah.
the somatic genes. Anyway, go on.
So, the ecclesia has its own environment, its own umwelt. There's the things in the world that the ecclesia has to keep track of, has to discriminate, has to, in effect, track. And there's a lot of things that it doesn't. This is oblivious to them.
Has no idea who's winning the World Series.
Yeah, there's lots of physical properties that are actually having effects on it that it nevertheless is essentially oblivious to. They don't matter enough, or haven't mattered in its past, so that it hasn't yet acquired any need to or any ability to represent them. But there are some features of its surroundings and of itself that it has to keep track of. I was trying not to use the word represent, but I'm gonna say.
So it keeps
if
track of temperature, say, without representing
if it-
temperature. So it keeps track of temperature, for
Salt
instance,
variance, temperature,
without representing temperature.
aqueous.
So you want to make a distinction between
Well-
track keeping and I mean,
Well,
like what?
no, I just
Yeah, I don't
didn't
think
want to
so either.
use the word represent prematurely, okay? Because I think
Premature
it may be better,
representation.
I think it may be better to use it only when things get a little bit more complicated. But still, we can look at the nervous system, tiny little nervous system of ecclesia, and we can reverse engineer it. And we can say,
You want to know what?
what's the ontology that best interprets the success of this nervous system? Now, maybe you say, I don't care about interpretation, I don't want to know. But if you're interested in understanding the reasons why the parts are organized the way they are, which is analogous, you might say, to reading the comments on the source code, which tells you, here's why we do it this way rather than that way. If you want to sort of write the source code for ecclesia, then you're going to you're going to catalog the ontology of ecclesia, and then you can say, the ecclesia in a very minimalistic, and we want to start small, we want to start it proto represents the following features of its world. And we are entitled to say that because these are the features that it responds aptly with regard to. And that's not magic.
Well,
It's
sorry,
not
what
magic.
that also means is that ontology gives us a model that seems to reproduce what the ecclesia does.
The point is, we now have a catalog of how the ecclesia gets through its life, why it does pretty well, but also, if we've done it right, we should be able to say, notice that the ecclesia is a sucker. It can't tell A from B. In the world it evolved, it needed A's. It can't tell A's from B's. If we put it in a world with B's, it's doomed because it will not distinguish A's from B's. So it's both its successes and its diagnostic failures that matter. When we've done that, we now have an ontology for the ecclesia, and so the states that serve to keep track of that ontology are its representational states. They are about those features of its world. Now, that's the first step. Now we want to build up from that to where we get to the monkey brain, and we want to see what's in the monkey's ontology and so forth.
So, and where I want us to.
Where do you want to stick to your footing?
I want to ask, on what ground you introduced the word about?
Very simple. I said, do you want to get the source code and understand why this works or not? If you want to understand why this design is better than that design, I mean, you reverse engineering and you're saying, wait a minute, why does it have this extra little source of, why is there this extra degree of freedom here? Why is there this extra variable in the system? Now, maybe the answer is no reason at all. But it may be, oh, it needs that variable because in one state, that's representing too hot. And in the other state, it's representing not too hot. And so it goes. We use the comments on the source code to characterize
Are these
the
heuristics or are
rationale.
they literal, the comments? Because when
They're
Candel did this work.
They're heuristics.
They're heuristics, okay, fine, then I don't need to go any
Is
further.
this a convincing account?
When Candel did this work,
Not
he
of
didn't, he
meaning.
didn't make any commitments to aboutness of the states of the motor ganglia and the neural ganglia of the aplasia.
Well, I'll have to look closely because I'm pretty sure I can find where he did.
Maybe heuristically though,
Yeah.
maybe in terms of, yeah.
Absolutely.
And
But that's what matters. That's all meaning is heuristic.
No, I think it's
that's all
convincing
meaning
about
is heuristics.
That's
That's
all
all
meaning.
I.
So that's not where I am.
Formal
That's not where I
mechanism,
am.
like
I totally
formal
disagree with that.
correspondences between, let's say, tracking
Well,
temperature
I
and this
know.
physical realization and this one. So it's a logistical device, but it's not actually.
I don't know. I mean, I rather liked putting it in terms of, if you think about reverse engineering a computer program, and while you're doing this, writing comments which explain each little part. Now, those are heuristics for the benefit of those who come later and want to understand how the thing works and why the parts are organized is there. So it's a very convenient way of interpreting the machinery that you've got when you're doing your reverse engineering. Now, I think that's what meaning is the interpretation of the machinery in exactly that sense. Now, if you think
us, as when we reverse engineer it.
yes,
You see why that's important?
yeah, but
But then you want to know, why does evolution preserve it?
Yes.
Why does evolution preserve it?
and there's no bias because somebody's got to do the interpreting. But
the interpretation by. So let's go now from the ecclesia to its interpretation by us. Just say the last.
and what's the problem with that? Oh, I think I know. All right.
I just want to hear the
The
last
ecclesia-
sentence one more time.
Just,
That the comments on the reverse engineering are heuristics that we use in order to keep track of what is going on in the actual distribution of physical matter that constitutes the aplasia and its neural circuitry, as opposed to attributions of properties to that circuitry like charge or pH or mass or protein composition.
All right, so, and the paper I sent around today on the evolution of reasons goes into this. At the level of aplasia, the aplasia does lots of things for reasons, but the aplasia doesn't know anything about the reasons, doesn't represent the reasons, doesn't know the reasons.
And doesn't have reasons.
Doesn't have reasons, but does things for reasons.
Right.
That's where the terminology comes in.
And,
Well, we can talk about it.
well, wait a minute, look, this is,
It's just the fundamental.
there-
No, that is an important
there's
point.
Please let
reasons-
Don go on.
Look.
Dan, go on.
There's reasons why, trees spread their limbs and why they send their roots down. The trees don't understand that, they don't need, they're the beneficiaries. But if you want to know why, asking for a reason, there's lots of reasons. And these are reasons of reverse engineering. And we can do it. There's reasons why we sneeze and why we blink. Those aren't our reasons. We don't have reasons for
And
blinking.
those reasons are causes of a certain kind.
Well, they're teleological reasons. They're answers to the question what for, not answers to the question how come.
But there are things that help us understand in
Yeah,
this
yeah.
efficiency sense. I mean,
Yeah.
we could just talk about the atoms in the trees
We
and
could,
figure out
but
what the
we
trees do
miss
without
out.
ever
We'll
referring.
be missing a
This
lot.
goes back
Yeah.
to
But we-
Dan's point about bringing the wine home,
Yeah.
right?
That's right.
His answer to your
Yeah.
Laplacian demon.
Exactly. I think, but that's my point. That is exactly the difference,
Yeah.
which I think
So now-
the meaning of meaning is in this efficiency, helpful,
That's
shortcut.
the point. That's the intentional stance. So now,
Justice
the
stands.
ecclesia, the ecclesia does things for reasons, but it doesn't appreciate reasons. It doesn't represent its reasons, but it does things for reasons. As we go up and get more complicated, eventually we get to organisms that have more elaborate nervous systems that don't just do things for reasons, but begin to represent their
So,
reasons.
and here's where my mystery emerges, because what we know from the work of Candell and others is that in our hippocampus, it's exactly the same molecular and somatic gene process that happens in the aplasia, and the only difference is 10 to the 10th neurons instead of 4 neurons. And my problem is, how does this difference of degree produce real reasons?
But
Reasons that the brain has,
Well-
which
well-
the aplasia, according to, as Dan rightly said, doesn't have.
Well, to give
Well,
you
let
an
me,
analogy.
there's differences of degree and differences of degree. Let's go way up and look at a case that I've been discussing for years, and that's the injury feigning in the piping plover. Now, this is cognitively controlled behavior. It's quite subtle, and experiments that, for instance, I can't remember her name at the moment, Carroll and Ristow did. The Carroll and Ristow did. We know that look, there are two possibilities. This is a sort of freak out behavior. The bird is just sort of having an epileptic seizure, or it's actually very clever.
strategy.
And it turns out it's pretty darn clever, because the piping plover is monitoring the predator, even monitoring whether the predator is gazing at her. And if the predator is looking away, she will
Stop.
she will amplify her squawking
to get his
behavior,
attention, right,
and
yeah.
she'll let the predator get closer. So there's a very subtle process by which the piping plover leads the predator away. Now, are there reasons why it's doing that? Yes. Does the piping plover understand them? No. The piping plover, again, is the beneficiary of having a nervous system that does things for reasons that the piping plover does not have to appreciate. So we have to go up some more. But the brains are getting bigger, and the capacities for representation are getting bigger. And just to cut to the chase, I am not going to say that animals are doing things that they have reasons for what they do, till you get to us and a few of our closest kin. And here, the reason I'm going to talk about them actually representing reasons, well, let me go to the easy case first, and I've already said this. When you're consciously representing reasons to yourself, you really are thinking about these things. There's actual processes in your head where the reasons themselves are represented. Dogs can't represent reasons to themselves. Chimpanzees can't represent reasons to themselves. I don't think. They can get close. Ruth Millikan suggests that when an animal can represent goals and actions in this sort of same space, we're getting close. And I think that there's something right about that, but it doesn't solve the problem, because representation and space, these are tricky words, and you can pull them in different shapes. But for the moment, I'm going to say, we're the only ones that represent our reasons. And the only reason we can represent our reasons is because, in addition to having brains, we have language. And it's because we're the symbolic species, it's because we have language that we can represent our reasons. And so that we can be sort of self-conscious intentional systems and be higher order intentional systems in a way that no other animal can be. And then we, with this power that we have, thanks to language, we can then look back at the whole tree of life. We can see all the reasons why sponges do what they do, and why bacteria do what they do, and why Ecclesia does what it does. We are, and it's heuristic, we are discovering the reasons why things happen. Darwin showed that all of these reasons could be honored without any representation of reasons by an intelligent designer. We're the first intelligent designers, and we're the first reverse engineers.
Yeah, can I ask a question? So representation, if I had to work in the lab,
yeah,
I would say it's a correlation between a neural state and an external state, right? So whenever there's a cat nearby, some cat part lights up in some systematic way. That's just, it's a picture.
In philosophy, we call that causal covariant information.
But so is that, and let me just flesh it out and ask David if this is how it goes through, right? I'm sure if I look in the brain, in a dog brain, I'll find correlations between neural firings.
Absolutely.
So
but you see,
yeah,
for the moment, I'm not going to call those representations.
So what's the extra magic that you have to put in? There's all sorts of correlations in the brain. I'm sure that's the case, right? Why can't I say that what means that this part of the brain is not representing that part of the brain, even in a dog, since I'll certainly find the correlations there?
It's the feedback of the verbal tokens and the inscriptional tokens onto conscious tokens.
Well,
Correlation
there's an
doesn't
answer,
solve
but
the
it's
problem.
not a
That's the
short
problem.
answer.
Okay, but you're saying that if I had a richer sense of represent, I would see why dogs had it and humans didn't have it, and I hopefully wouldn't have.
No, the other way.
Oh, okay, sorry, yes. If I had a slightly more sophisticated, if I just enriched my scientific theory representation, I would see why that didn't go through. That's what you're saying.
You would see precisely why a term like representation is so problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see what we might call the florid, robust, all-in concept of representation.
Mm-hmm.
And those are things like words and pictures and maps. And then we can see by as it were, courtesy, once we get clear about what those are, and see how people use them, how representation users use them, then we can look back in the brain and see, oh, there's something which is rather like a map in the animal's brain, and we can see how, in effect, the animal brain uses this in the way that people use maps. And if we don't find enough of a similarity in the processes of exploitation it's not really a map, it's sort of like a map, but don't think of it as a map, because then you're imputing too much of a map user, too much of a map reader to the system. So
Nobody in there looking at the map.
Every use of representation talk, aside from the most florid human cases, is attenuated, and you have to put it in scare quotes, and you have to understand that it is only sort of map reading, only sort of image processing, and then particularly
with simple systems, with relatively simple systems, the intentional stance is often useful, but in principle it's optional. You don't need it. With humans, if you don't take the intentional stance, you will be missing information. You'll be missing generalizations about their behaviors, and you'll be missing counterfactual, and you'll be failing to make, and you'll lose predictive leverage.
I think we should actually contemplate declaring victory. for the day.
Victory?
Yes.
For a good session.
So I want to just end by saying that I don't have any scare quotes around what's going on in bacterial DNA. I don't have any problem with saying that there's representation there. It isn't what goes on in brains. But if we don't understand something as simple as that, this talk about brains is going to get us nowhere. I'm really spent my life trying to deal with this. I keep backing down. I want it simpler and simpler and simpler. Aplesia for me is way too complex. And we've got a nervous system already. We've got an animal that's behaving. It's way too complex. We don't have a clue what we're talking about when we talk about molecular relationships that do carry information, that do represent. If we don't get that one straight, we can't. How can we imagine we can talk about this other stuff? I mean, I just think it's we're trying to fly before we can crawl.
Tree rings have information too.
Yeah.
But do they represent?
Nope.
No,
See,
I would say so. Not.
I say no because the tree isn't using that information in any way.
That's right.
Whereas
that's right.
the bacterium is.
Yeah. Bacteria uses the gradient of sucrose in its environment.
Well, that's why that's the sort of minimalist.
Yeah, but you need a self. There's something that benefits from it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've left out of this whole story, even about evolution, natural selection requires there to be something that we would call a self, something that is the beneficiary of this dynamic.
Yeah.
And we've left that completely out of the game so far. And so evolution could happen, with sticks sitting on the ground. It can't. It has to have a self that's dynamic, active, and self-creating, self-preserving.
Self-protecting.
Self-protecting, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So without that, we can't even get started with this game.
Yeah. Agree there. Yeah, absolutely.